Welcome to the Ezra Digital 2020 Education Series. Now to Steve for introductions.
Thank you, Mallory. I am Steve Bisbee. I'm the president and founder of eOriginal, which is a leading provider of digital transaction management solutions, primarily for financial services. I oversaw the creation and delivery of unique digital solutions that replace paper processes and expedite transactions and create business process efficiencies for over 600 clients in a digital ecosystem. The Electronic Signatures and Records Association was formed to educate and advocate for the use and acceptance of digital signatures, records, and transactions. I have been on the board of Ezra since its inception. Our members are dedicated to providing, promoting, and participating in Ezra values. These are expertise, leadership, collaboration, accessibility, and technology neutrality. As part of Ezra's educational mission, we have created this webinar series that will run through December. The education series provides insight and practical guidance on the business, technology, and legal implementation issues across a very wide spectrum of applications. There'll be presentations from Ezra members and their partners on topics ranging from remote online notarization, digital mortgage and auto finance, to the use of voice signatures and other biometric methods to authenticate signers and execute documents. Although e-sign was enacted 20 years ago, there's still a learning curve as companies continue to transform their business practices. These issues are of critical importance during this time of social distancing, remote work, and contactless consumer engagement. We hope that you find these webinars useful. And so finally, I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Dan Putterbaugh. Dan is the Director of Product, Intellectual Property, and Regulatory Affairs for DocuSign. Since its inception in 2003, DocuSign has been on a mission to accelerate business and simplify life for companies and people around the world. Prior to joining DocuSign, Dan was Director of Strategic Development at Adobe for 12 years. Dan also served 7 years as the Assistant General Counsel for Intuit. An attorney for over 20 years, Dan has written and spoken extensively on issues related to electronic signatures and records. Dan, welcome to our Ezra presentation today.
Thanks so much, Steve, and thank you for all of the excellent work that Ezra does in raising awareness and understanding around electronic signatures. To your point, even though the law has been on the books for quite a while, we still have plenty of work to do to get people educated. So very necessary, important work. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dan Putterbaugh, and today I'm going to be talking on the topic of digital transformation is the new normal. And I will say at the outset that I struggled a little bit with this because digital transformation is one of these terms that is used so often that one's eyes begin to glaze over a little bit. And so I would actually like to sort of subhead this presentation with transformation is the new normal. It's both digital and, as I think we've all seen, the transformations that are going on extend into as netizens might say, IRL, in real life transformation that is occurring around us all the time. So what I'm going to talk about today is start with sort of this physical transformation, because I think that really does set the stage for how governments have responded to current circumstances. I'm going to talk a little bit about privacy later on, but then in the middle here and for the main body of the presentation, I don't want it to just be entirely academic, to talk about HR and transformation, because I think that's one of the places where we've seen the most impact, where the need to onboard and unfortunately offboard employees, and in fact to onboard them entirely remotely. Speaking from my own personal experience, I was interviewed, hired, and onboarded entirely remotely at DocuSign, which was a new experience for me. And it has almost become a whole new normal in and of itself. And I think a number of us that have been through it have been surprised to discover that it was not nearly as jarring an experience as we thought it might be initially. So just a couple of words about DocuSign. The DocuSign Agreement Cloud, we're primarily known for electronic signatures, but the Agreement Cloud includes contract lifecycle management. Through our acquisition of Seal, we offer document artificial intelligence. We really are an entire ecosystem of agreements, and really are constantly in the business of trying to push forward and push at the outside of the envelope about what is possible. So that includes obviously document AI. It includes things like smart clauses and smart contracts. So this is sort of our entire ecosystem here. We have over 350 pre-built integrations, a ton of APIs. Electronic signatures is all that we do. Well, electronic signatures, and I would say electronic agreements is all that we do. And so that is our main focus. DocuSign's been very much involved in responding to COVID-19. These are just 3 examples where we have we've worked with public sector to deal with, I think, what everyone recognizes are these absolutely unprecedented levels of demand for unemployment insurance claims, in getting aid out to healthcare providers, and I think more interestingly or more future thinking, New York's Project Cupid, which has allowed actual marriage licenses to be obtained online for the first time. So let's talk about physical transformation, because I think this is one that maybe doesn't get talked about as much as it should. And at first I want to talk about laptop proliferation. And I think for some of us, this was a bit of a surprise. I think that those of us, especially those who work in tech, had sort of assumed everyone has a laptop, don't we all have laptops? And it really was COVID that brought to the forefront that, in fact, especially in public sector, huge swaths of the workforce do not have that. We also discovered that what had been a nice to have for students in the sort of K through 12 area became a have to have. And so that had a real impact on the ability to actually get one's hands on a reasonably priced laptop. The second thing that we've seen is, and this is a little bit more anecdotal, but there's a number of articles on it, is the rise of the home office. If you are like me, you probably had some rudimentary home office that you worked out of occasionally when you were sick or you had a work from home day, but it's become an entirely different thing. You know, and along with exercise bikes being sold out on Amazon, standing desks, and every other piece of home office accoutrement that you might want to put your hands on are frequently sold out. It's gotten a little bit better recently, but that has been this very in real life impact of COVID. And then worker migration. Being a former Bay Area resident, I can talk to the fact that the number of people who are moving out of, especially San Francisco and New York, at least temporarily, has been really quite something, and is really sort of changing the landscape of the country. And then finally, sort of the impact of bubbling. And I think most people are comfortable with this term at this point, but the impact of people forming what are in effect these sort of extended friend and family groups, where they can still socialize, still interact with people, but do so in a safe way. And so I think you've seen these sorts of headlines: the back to school laptop shortage, the fact that it has become difficult at times to buy a decent laptop, the rents falling in San Francisco and New York, and the suburban renaissance. And I think that these are real impacts. And I think that I only spend this much time talking to this point because, one, I think it's terribly interesting, and two, because I think that when you're looking at the digital transformation elements of all of this, it's important to have that sort of, it's not happening in a vacuum, right? There are in real life changes that are happening at the same time. So let's talk about government and transformation. I think some, I would include myself among them, have been somewhat surprised to see around the globe how quickly a number of governments responded to the situation. In particular, if you look at Singapore, which for the purposes of responding to COVID in any case, has a tremendous advantage in that one party controls virtually all of the sort of governmental bodies. They suspended all contractual obligations, allowed remote solemnization of marriages, temporary relief from inability to perform contracts, very quickly decided in a way that the US wasn't quite able to get a handle on, that Parliament did not have to sit in Parliament House, and decided that parliamentary elections could be done remotely for voters that were subject to quarantine or stay-at-home orders. And then in the US, you've seen the IRS sort of have to dramatically change what policies it had in place and what it was willing to allow. And I think you saw the same thing in Australia. And there's sort of case after case after case of this. For those who have followed it a bit, I'm sure we each have sort of our favorites. New Zealand is frequently looked at as a bit of a model for how they handled some of this. But there was somewhat uniquely an instance where there was a crisis, and you saw governments around the globe respond in this very definitive and forceful way. So I think that is also sort of in the fabric of all of this change, and we'll get to that a little bit more when we get to talking about remote online notarization a little bit towards the end here. So let's get down to the practical matters. I think the biggest thing that people are wrestling with in the enterprise world, in any case, are the impacts on HR. As I've said, I am a proud, entirely remotely hired and onboarded DocuSign employee. I have only met all of my team members from the shoulders up, if you will, and yet it does work, but it also presents some real challenges. So here are really the big three. Equipment access. Obviously, in nearly every enterprise, no one can start really being a productive member of the workforce until they get access to that equipment. In fact, they very often need access to that equipment before anything else can happen, before onboarding. Onboarding is almost always, there's a substantial portion where one is sort of walked through all the systems that are in place at that particular company, doing one's I-9 verification. So that's essential. Secondarily, doing that remote onboarding. And, I think many of us have been used to a situation where one comes in, you've got a half day or a full day orientation, you sort of shake hands with everyone, a lot of insurance information is handed out. Well, that's all gone. So that's an awful lot of paper to digitize. And, I think just as important, really, a challenge of sort of building a certain amount of esprit de corps among this sort of incoming class, and sort of how do you handle that? Finally, and unfortunately, offboarding employees has become a big issue. Depending on the particular industry that one is in, some are hiring furiously, others not so much. But in any case, there's simply a lot of activity in this space. So some organizations are on a hiring spree. Some of these are totally unsurprising, like Instacart, but CVS, Walgreens, Kroger, they are having to onboard people at this rate that we've simply never seen before, and they're needing to meet this sort of enormous demand that's being created by the current situation. And so it's not just that this all needs to happen remotely. It's that it needs to happen remotely, and it needs to happen at like enormous volume levels. So the challenge I would say is sort of redoubled as a result of that. So here is sort of the statement. You know, remote hiring and onboarding at scale is overwhelming HR departments. HR departments, many of them are still very dependent on paper processes. Sometimes that's because of very specific regulatory requirements. Sometimes it's just a matter of, for whatever reason, they've really never had to make that push into a digital process. And whether it's in HR or it's in global processes, we're really seeing that that COVID is prompting this real acceleration where it's not sort of, well, it would be a good idea if we digitally transformed. It's become mandatory. It's become absolutely essential in order to do so. So let's look at a use case. New hire IT equipment access. This is obviously critical. You go through an entire process. Having just gone through this recently, if you haven't in a while, you probably do not fully realize how much you have customized your laptop, that you know where everything that you need is stored. And so there's an enormous thing of getting access to that laptop, installing all the appropriate applications. In many instances, if you're on a sort of highly controlled system, you're going to need a lot of help desk back and forth to get applications installed. A lot of companies do not allow you to independently install many applications. You have to complete the HR training and submit required documentation, and then obviously onboard with your team itself. And this all needs to happen remotely now. So I think that people are saying that it can be pretty challenging. So the problem, how do you remotely identify the employee to ensure that they can get their IT equipment access and start onboarding on day one? And I think the solution that we have seen is using ID verification to establish the identity of a new hire. Again, I will use my own experience to say this is exactly the process that I went through. So this is obviously a DocuSign example, but one uses ID verification for password access as part of an IT onboarding. For those who are not familiar with ID verification, this involves, it can involve a variety of different processes, but typically it involves taking an image of your government ID, and then also taking an image of image picture, really, of yourself, and then ensuring that those match before issuing passwords, before sending out equipment that would allow one onto the system network. This allows collaboration. It allows them to get onboarded very, very quickly. I think that very often we've seen in the past, there can be quite a bit of delay in getting equipment to people. Every day that they don't have equipment is another day that they're not going to be productive. And so that ability to get somebody up and running really, really quickly while still working remotely is just absolutely essential. Second, let's talk about I-9s. I-9s is an essential form for establishing the employee identity, and manually processing them really hampers HR's ability to work efficiently and confirm their compliance. So again, you use an ID verification process, and here we're showing it that somebody gets the onboarding package, they capture an ID verification is captured. Here we're also showing a passport. Obviously, that's this sort of ID verification where it's really within the enterprise, can use a variety of different forms of ID, and then the new hire signs all of the onboarding documents. So this essential, we've often, and for those of us who have worked with certificate authorities and trust service providers, really familiar with this process of presenting one's ID and oneself at the same time in order to verify your identity. This is essentially just a virtual version of that that really does allow this much faster onboarding. So use case 3, let's talk a little bit about offboarding employees. I think that this unfortunately is a reality as well. Unfortunately, we're also seeing it at volume. So, the solutions are electronic signatures, ID verification, and pre-built forms that allow one to change one's status. This is slightly more straightforward in that you've already identified the individual. So HR in sort of the post-COVID-19 world, there is likely, especially in the US, the need to really adapt to new, much longer term norms and invest really heavily in e-learning and remote work and create this emphasis on worker well-being. I know that at DocuSign, there's not only been a tremendous investment in all of the processes that we use here, but a real investment in trying to recreate as much as possible the sort of in-person work experience. Having meetings that are just entirely social meetings. I know that when I joined, I would send out meetings to folks on my team that were just called break room, which were entirely intended to recreate, the experience of walking into the break room to get a cup of coffee and running into them. And, I always said that they were really just there for me to find out if you have a dog or a cat or siblings or, that sort of thing. But I think there is really a need because a lot of folks do a ton of their socializing around the workplace to sort of try to create that same sense in a remote environment. So that's been one of the areas where there's been a ton of activity is around HR transactions. The other one where I think a lot of people are fairly familiar with this is in the area of remote online notarization. And I want to talk about this just briefly, but one of the things I definitely want to do is to talk about what it is. So I do talk to folks about remote online notarization, or RON, with some regularity. But one of the things that I often hear is there is not a lot of clarity around exactly what it is. So the common components, what makes it so different, everyone's used to normal notarization. That is where you appear in person, or someone drives to your home in the current environment, and then hopefully continuing to socially distance. You execute documents, they witness you doing so, they take a record of that. E-notary, which gets confused a bit with remote online notarization, is simply that same sort of in-person process taking place electronically. What makes remote online notarization special is that it is truly remote, that the notarization is being done essentially using video chat. And there's a number of regulations and steps and things that need to happen. I don't mean to imply that the video chat is casual in any way, but that is the meat of it. It also allows notaries in one state to perform notarizations in another state. But so the common components are it can be done over video chat. It requires that the notary authenticate the person signing just as they always did. There needs to be a recording of that communication, and then that communication needs to be maintained. And this is true. This is true here. It's also true for sort of video-based authentications that are done in the EU for the purposes of digital certificates. So there is always a maintained record. So one isn't simply relying on the word of the individual. There is effectively an auditable video that you can go back and look at. So those are the common components that you see with remote online notarization. There are sort of variations in the US from state to state. So there'll be some states require you to have a special notary registration so that you can do this type. They will have specific requirements around the authentication process for the signer. We'll have controls around the location signer, and we'll have different record keeping requirements for the notary. But generally, they are relatively similar, but I'm sure if Mark Aronson is on the call, he would advise you to closely read your own state's requirements here. Now, the reason that I mention Ron is because one of the things that you saw in the US was there had already been a real movement towards more and more states legalizing notarization via video chat. And you can sort of see the list over here on the left. What happened post-COVID was this dramatic acceleration in all those states that had not yet passed it, where they either were rushing to pass very similar laws or suspended a number of the requirements that had been in place for either electronic notarization or notarization, period. And then at the federal level as well, there's been a lot of activity around this. So I think that, I suppose for those of us who have worked in the area of digital documents and electronic signatures for a while, we've always been aware that nearly everything can be done remotely, and that notarization was this real issue. It was the one thing that was really out there that still had to be done in person, accepting marriage certificates and death certificates, adoption certificates. But for businesses and for when you're looking at sort of relatively high volume transactions, notarized transactions were the one that were still really a stumbling block. So I really think it's worth calling out here that we're seeing a shift where this last stumbling block, it may well be going away. And so worth paying attention to, look at your state's law. I honestly think that a number of states that are currently passing temporary laws may well find that, hey, while we had the temporary statutes in place, nothing really catastrophic happened. Let's go ahead and make those changes permanent. So, and I also want to talk a little bit about privacy and transformation, particularly CCPA and Schrems 2. And the reason that I decided to include this, it's a little bit different from the other pieces that I touch on. But the reason that I decided to include this is all of these other elements that we're talking about this tremendous increase of digitization, right? Whether it's remote online notary, or it's HR, or it's transactions that the government enables, or buying a standing desk for your home office. All of these things sort of represent a move towards digitization. But I think I would be remiss if I didn't also talk about the fact that that is all happening against the background of a lot of changes in privacy law. And so I want to talk briefly about the changes in the US, and then talk about changes in the EU that nonetheless I think are very impactful on US practitioners. So as we digitize, governments legislate. So we've always been used to the federal regulations that have been out there, GLBA, HIPAA, COPPA, FERPA. There is no federal privacy regulation, so it really happens at the state level. But what you saw as of January this year was the California Consumer Privacy Act. I really believe, and it does differ from the EU's GDPR regulation in some important material respects, but I really feel like California, being somewhat frustrated with the fact that we still don't have federal privacy regulation, essentially decided to pass one of its own that was going to have really wide-ranging consequences on the entire country, simply because the size of California's economy, the size of its population, it was going to have tremendous downstream impacts on anyone who wanted to do business in or with Californians. So that act is now in place. I won't pretend to be an expert on this, but I will tell you that it is much more strict than anything else on the books in the US. As a result, there is a revised version of it that is on the ballot. But the shorthand, I think, for understanding CCPA and the sort of canvas against which you should look at all of your digitization efforts is that CCPA brings the US in many ways much closer to an EU type model, where there are much stronger protections for the consumer, much stronger ability for them to get access to their data, to control where their data goes, to get notice in advance, and as the little quiet sub-bullet class actions would indicate, and forms of redress that are designed to make it very financially painful to not be in compliance with its terms. So stepping outside, I feel that it is so, it has such a large impact on everyone in the US. I did want to talk a little bit about EU-US data transfer frameworks. So here's a great little timeline. I think many of us remember sort of 2000 when the safe harbor framework went into place that allowed data transfer between the EU and the US. And then as a result of really a graduate student named Max Schrems, which is why you'll hear these called Schrems and Schrems 2, decided to bring suit in the EU, essentially saying that safe harbor was not, in fact, valid for protecting the data of EU citizens broadly. And in fact was successful. And for those of us who work in technology and work in technology that touches on that continent, the day that safe harbor was invalidated is one that we remember well. It really required, even though it was expected, it still required quite a bit of scrambling to understand how we were going to handle this going forward. This was then quickly replaced by the EU-US Privacy Shield in 2016, which was designed to essentially reestablish the flow of data between the EU and the US. But very recently, Max Schrems once again brought suit, and the European Court of Justice ruled that the Privacy Shield is invalid. So hopefully no one out there is still relying on the Privacy Shield for its data transfers between the US and the EU, because that is no longer good law. So what's the impact? The Privacy Shield is invalidated. That is not going to work for transferring personal data between the European Economic Area and the US. Standard corporate clauses have been reaffirmed explicitly by the court, and binding corporate rules have been reaffirmed implicitly. So you still have ways to affect these sorts of data transfers, but it's just more labor intensive. For those of us who remember the sort of good old days of Safe Harbor and Privacy Shield, one essentially sort of self-certified that you were compliant with its terms and went on about your business. Here we really are talking about additional papering around various transactions in order to make sure that you are being compliant, and as such makes this piece a little bit more difficult. And again, it's why I sort of call it out as something to think about when you're thinking about the increasing digitization. So what else should we expect to see? So there is likely to be, in the EU, there are a number of what are called data protection authorities, some more activist than others. They are likely to continue to be very vigilant about how the US transfers data of EU citizens back and forth across the Atlantic. Almost certainly there will be yet another attempt to create something that is an agreement essentially between the two, I suppose, between the EU and the US, a privacy, and won't be called Safe Harbor, won't be called Privacy Shield. I don't know what it will be called this time, but certainly they're almost certainly trying to create a new one as quickly as they can. And then a global impact about transfer to other countries outside of the EU and the US. So that's really it for me. I'm happy to take questions, comments, discussion, but I thank you for your time. I think it's an extraordinarily interesting time to be looking at electronic signatures, to be looking at digitization. And I think that we're seeing organizations both really being pushed to move that way very, very quickly. But I think with this last bit on privacy, I just sort of mean to remind everyone that there are still some sort of cautions along the way and some rigor that we need to have in place in order to be able to do that. But other than that, thank you so much.
Dan, thank you very much. Dan, a quick question. When you get to streams 2, does that invalidate prior data transfer agreements that had been in place beforehand?
No, it just invalidates, and I'm not a privacy attorney, so others, if there is one on the line, feel free to correct me, but it just was limited to invalidating the Privacy Shield. Both of the Schrems matters were really focused on the agreements that had been reached between the US and the EU. So they didn't have any sort of, to my understanding, I don't think they had impacts beyond that.
Well, Dan, thank you for answering my question, and thank you for your presentation today. It was really valuable, I'm sure to many, but certainly to me. So I wanted to highlight about what Ezra is doing. So Ezra really focuses also on public policy initiatives, and you'll see on the screen, these are just examples of them. We're looking at e-wills, electronic will legislation, odometer. There's now a federal digital odometer act, which is being looking at how we can ensure that they're being utilized properly. We have a whole team which is working on the digital registration of titling for vehicles, both for insurance purposes, release of liens, and so forth. E-Notary, as Dan just mentioned, is another area where we're focused at a federal level, looking at federal legislation to trying to resolve some of these issues, as well as individual state initiatives. Blockchain, digital ledger technology, distributed ledger technologies, and other AI and machine learning, other areas where technology is moving into the digital transaction space. The IRS in their e-signature policy. And then what we're seeing is with a lot of the subsidizing programs, whether they be the PPP loans or TALF, Main Street lending, and others. The Federal Reserve banks now are going to have to adjust to be able to take digital assets or collateralized digital assets, as are the Federal Home Loan Bank. So we have groups of people who are focusing on those initiatives. So for those that are participating today, thank you. And we hope that you would also join Ezra and benefit from the combined expertise of our members and support our efforts in advocating for a trusted digital economy for all. You can find out more about Ezra and this series on Ezra's website at www.esignrecords.org. Please see the membership section of our website. So on behalf of Ezra and Dan, I want to thank you very much for joining us today.